Welcome to our channel. Can you imagine? Black legends who once stood at the pinnacle of fame, basking in the spotlight, adored by millions, only to face a devastating and lonely end. Once celebrated, now forgotten. Their bodies, once full of life and power, reduced to frailty, ravaged by the relentless grip of AIDS. This disease didn't just claim their lives. It dragged them into a cruel spiral of stigma and isolation, turning their final days into a silent tragedy. From dazzling stages and roaring stadiums to cold, desolate hospital rooms, their fate took a heartbreaking turn no one could have foreseen. This is the untold story of 21 black icons. Stars who once burned bright but were taken too soon, lost in the agony of AIDS. Join us as we honor their legacies and revisit their tragic final chapters in today's video. Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe. The tragic farewell of a legend. Arthur Ashe was more than just a tennis icon. He was a symbol of resilience, justice, and unshakable dignity. In 1975, he shattered barriers by becoming the first black man to win Wimbledon, a victory that echoed far beyond the court in an era still plagued by racial injustice. But Ashe was more than an athlete. He was a scholar, a relentless activist, and a voice for the voiceless, spreading a message of strength and compassion to the world. Yet, on February 6, 1993, in the sterile quiet of a New York hospital room, his extraordinary journey came to an end. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilator and the tearful gazes of his wife and young daughter. Once a picture of strength and agility, Ashe had withered away. His body ravaged, reduced to little more than skin and bone after months of battling the relentless grip of AIDS. Each breath was a struggle, his cracked lips whispering against the weight of an illness that drained him of life. His sunken eyes, clouded with exhaustion and pain, faded into unconsciousness as the final moments approached. No one could have imagined that a man of such discipline and resilience would fall to HIV, but fate is cruel. In 1983, during what should have been a routine heart surgery, Ashe was unknowingly given HIV-contaminated blood in a transfusion, a mistake that would seal his fate. When he learned the devastating truth, he chose silence, not out of fear for himself, but protect his family from the storm that would follow. For nearly a decade, he carried the secret. But in 1992, relentless media pressure forced him to step forward and reveal his diagnosis to the world. Even in his final days, as the disease drained his body and left him in crushing solitude, Ashe remained the embodiment of grace, dignity, and quiet strength. Arthur Ashe's story is not just one of triumphs and losses on the tennis court. It is a lesson in courage, in the power of resilience, and in the unwavering spirit of a man who refused to be defined by tragedy. His legacy endures, not only in sports history, but in the hearts of those who continue to fight for justice, equality, and the right to live with dignity. Alvin Ailey. Alvin Ailey. The tragedy of a genius who could never live his truth. Alvin Ailey was a visionary choreographer, a pioneer who brought black contemporary dance to the global stage. As the founder of the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, he revolutionized the art form with breathtaking works like Revelations, weaving movement with soul and storytelling that touched millions. Yet behind the brilliance, his life was shrouded in silence, secrecy, and unspoken pain. In late November 1989, Ailey was admitted to Lenox Hill Hospital in New York. The man who once infused every motion with vitality and spirit now lay motionless, his body ravaged by disease. AIDS had stripped him of the energy that made him a force of nature. He had contracted HIV from unsafe relationships during an era when being openly gay was met with hostility and discrimination. He never publicly acknowledged his sexuality, nor did he speak of the fears and loneliness that haunted him throughout his life. As the days passed, he slipped into a deep coma, dependent on cold, unfeeling machines to keep him alive. One by one, his organs began to fail. His skin grew dry and sallow, his once powerful body now frail beyond recognition. Each breath was a fragile tether to life, a whisper of existence slowly fading. Knowing what awaited him, Ailey made one final decision before his death. He instructed doctors to list leukemia as the cause. Even in his last moments, he feared that the stigma of AIDS would tarnish his legacy. On December 1st, 1989, Alvin Ailey took his final bow, not under the warm glow of stage lights, but in the stark silence of a hospital room. Yet his art endures. His dances still speak, still move, still remind the world that there was once a man who dared to dream, even when he could never fully live his truth. Fela Anikulapo Kuti. Fela Anikulapo Kuti, the king of Afrobeat and the price of freedom. Fela Anikulapo Kuti, the undisputed king of Afrobeat, transformed pulsating drum rhythms and fiery brass melodies into a weapon against oppression. From the slums of Lagos to the grand stages of Europe, he was more than a musician. He was a voice of defiance, a relentless warrior for justice. His songs, laced with razor-sharp political messages, rattled corrupt regimes and ignited the spirit of resistance. But in the end, his downfall did not come from the enemies he fought. It came from within. In his final days, Fela lay helpless in a hospital room in Lagos. The once mighty figure, whose presence electrified thousands, was reduced to a skeletal frame, his body ravaged by disease. Necrotic sores covered his skin, reeking of decay. His flesh, once vibrant with life, had withered to a fragile husk. The bed linens were soaked in pus, the air thick with the stench of infection. Nurses changed his sheets constantly, but they couldn't keep away the relentless swarm of flies circling his rotting wounds. His lips cracked and bled. His hollow eyes drifted into an empty void. His bony fingers curled inward, lifeless. His swollen feet darkened, turning purple with cold. Stiffened joints locked him in silent agony. Each breath rattled in his chest, a gurgling, suffocating sound, like the final chains of life being dragged across the threshold of death. AIDS had taken everything from him. His immune system collapsed entirely, pushing him into a coma. He no longer felt pain, yet his body trembled with weak convulsions, as if waging one last, futile battle. His lungs, drowning in infection, wheezed in a desperate, failing rhythm. It was his reckless lifestyle, his infamous 27 wives, his endless affairs, his defiance of modern medicine that had led him here. Even as the disease consumed him, he refused Western treatment, clinging instead to herbal remedies and spiritual strength. On August 2nd, 1997, Fela Anikulapo Kuti was gone. His family concealed the truth, wrapping his death in vague explanations, as if shielding his legacy from the stigma of the disease that had claimed him. But nothing could erase what he had left behind. Fela, the fire that refused to be extinguished, had finally burned out, not at the hands of his enemies, but by his own unrelenting pride. And yet, his music still echoes through time, a defiant anthem, a war cry against oppression, a reminder that once there was a man who set an entire continent ablaze. Max Robinson. Max Robinson, the spotlight and the solitude behind the lens. In the 1970s, Max Robinson shattered barriers in American media, becoming the first black man to anchor a national broadcast on ABC News. With his deep, steady voice, composed presence, and sharp intellect, he was more than just a newsman. He was a symbol of hope for millions of black Americans in an era still shadowed by racial inequality. Yet, behind the polished delivery and the glow of the studio lights was a man weighed down by secrets, silently carrying a struggle that would follow him to his final breath. In the tragic last chapter of his life, Max Robinson lay motionless in an intensive care unit at Howard University Hospital in Washington, D.C. The room was cold, sterile, no cameras, no applause. Only the rhythmic hum of the ventilator filled the silence. His body, once strong and commanding, had withered away, his skin clinging to bone as tubes and wires wrapped around him, desperately prolonging what little life remained. At the height of his career, Robinson had contracted HIV through unsafe relationships. But in a world that treated the disease with fear and stigma, he kept his illness hidden. The virus, however, showed no mercy. AIDS ravaged his immune system, leaving him defenseless as pneumonia filled his lungs, drowning him breath by breath. Each inhale became a struggle, a painful, desperate grasp for survival. On December 20th, 1988, at just 49 years old, Max Robinson exhaled for the last time. It was only after his death that the truth emerged, sending shockwaves to the public and leaving many in mourning. Yet, even in tragedy, his legacy endures. Max Robinson was more than a journalist. He was a trailblazer, a pioneer who opened doors for future generations of black reporters. His impact on national media remains indelible, ensuring that his story, his struggle, and his triumph will never be forgotten. Sylvester King, and the tragedy of fame. Sylvester was a radiant star of the 1970s, a voice that electrified dance floors with "You Make Me Feel Mighty Real." More than just a disco icon, he was a symbol of liberation, a fearless beacon of self-expression for the LGBTQ+ community. But in the end, the very freedom he championed led him into the cruel embrace of relentless disease. In the early 1980s, as HIV/AIDS spread like a silent predator through San Francisco's gay community, Sylvester became one of its earliest casualties. He contracted the virus during a time when the world was still shrouded in ignorance about the epidemic. When he was diagnosed in 1986, he refused to let the disease define him. He kept performing, pouring his soul into every note, every stage, until his body could no longer keep up. By 1988, as the illness tightened its grip, Sylvester made a choice. He refused hospitalization, choosing instead to stay in his small San Francisco apartment. Once alive with music and laughter, now hauntingly quiet. His body withered, his weight plummeting below 100 pounds. His skin cracked, marred by deep purple lesions. His lips, dry and bleeding, could no longer form words. Each breath became a battle, each gasp a cruel reminder that the end was near. On December 16, 1988, Sylvester took his final breath, abandoned by family, cast aside by prejudice. But his friends refused to let his legacy fade. They didn't mourn him with sorrow alone. They honored him with celebration, ensuring that his voice, like his spirit, would never be silenced. Even in death, Sylvester remained what he had always been, mighty, real, and unforgettable. Larry Riley, a star dimmed by suffering. Larry Riley was a beloved presence on American television, captivating audiences with his role in Knots Landing. He was the embodiment of talent and dedication, a performer who brought depth and charisma to every scene. But behind the bright lights and applause, he fought a silent, agonizing battle, one that would ultimately claim his life. On June 6, 1992, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, Larry Riley took his final breath. His last days were marked by suffering beyond words. He lay motionless in his hospital bed, his body a mere shadow of what it once was, wasted away by illness, unrecognizable even to those who knew him best. The vibrant, expressive face that had once lit up screens had become pale and hollow, marred by lesions from relentless infections. His once bright eyes, full of warmth and emotion, stared vacantly into the abyss. Every breath was a struggle, weak, ragged, and punctuated by painful, dry coughs that shook his frail body. Swollen from kidney failure, he could no longer move. Larry had contracted HIV in the 1980s, a time when the disease was shrouded in fear, ignorance, and stigma. Like so many in the entertainment industry, he became one of its countless victims. But he kept his diagnosis hidden, terrified of the backlash that could end his career. He worked tirelessly, pushing forward despite the growing toll on his health, until it became impossible to conceal the truth any longer. In the end, his immune system collapsed completely, leaving his body defenseless. The pain was unbearable, his suffering immense. Yet through it all, Larry Riley remained a fighter. His final days were marked by solitude and agony, but his legacy as an artist endures. His story is more than just a tragic cautionary tale about the devastation of AIDS. It is a testament to resilience, to the unwavering spirit of a man who gave everything to his craft. Though he left this world far too soon, his artistry, his passion, and his impact will never fade. Willie Smith, a fashion visionary gone too soon. Willie Smith, the most influential black fashion designer of the 1980s, revolutionized the industry with Willie Wear, transforming streetwear into high fashion. At the peak of his success, he was unstoppable, raking in millions and redefining style with his bold, effortless designs. But just as his star burned its brightest, illness struck, leaving behind an irreplaceable void in the fashion world. In April 1987, Smith was admitted to Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York, battling persistent respiratory failure. The sterile, lifeless hospital room was a stark contrast to the vibrant runways he once dominated. once full of energy and boundless creativity. His body had become frail and unrecognizable. His weight had plummeted. His skin was dry and cracked. His sunken eyes held little of their former brilliance. Purple lesions dotted his forehead, a chilling sign of his immune system's collapse. Unbeknownst to him, years of living freely within New York's bohemian and artistic circles had exposed him to HIV, a silent predator ravaging his body from within. The virus led to pneumocystis pneumonia, a deadly complication of AIDS. His lungs filled with fluid. His breathing grew more labored, and soon he was dependent on machines just to stay alive. The once steady hands that crafted thousands of groundbreaking designs now trembled, stiffened, and turned cold. On April 17, 1987, Willie Smith passed away at just 39 years old. His death sent shockwaves through the fashion world, which had anticipated even greater brilliance from him. But his legacy endures. He shattered barriers, opening doors for black designers who once had no access to the industry. His designs remain timeless, a lasting testament to the creative force he was. Michael Peters. Michael Peters, a choreographic genius gone too soon. Michael Peters was a visionary behind some of pop culture's most legendary dance moves, most notably the electrifying choreography in Michael Jackson's Thriller. His artistry defined the 1980s, shaping the golden era of music videos and revolutionizing dance on screen. But just as his creative fire burned at its brightest, a silent, relentless enemy pulled him into the shadows. By late 1994, Michael lay in his Los Angeles apartment, his once powerful body devastated by illness. The man who had once given movement its magic could barely move at all. His muscles, once fluid and commanding, had withered away, his athletic frame reduced to fragile skin and brittle bones. His lungs, heavy with fluid, fought for every breath. Each inhale a painful, rattling gasp, each exhale a battle against suffocation. The hands that had sculpted masterpieces, the hands that had breathed life into dance, now trembled, frail and powerless. He could no longer hold a pen, let alone command the stage. He had contracted HIV during his years in the entertainment industry, at a time when the disease was wrapped in fear and misinformation. For years, he carried a secret, refusing to let it define him. But as his condition worsened, there was no more hiding. On August 29, 1994, at just 46 years old, Michael Peters took his final bow, alone, yet forever immortalized in the rhythms he left behind. Another brilliant creative force, silenced too soon. But his absence is not an ending. His legacy lives on in every sharp pop, every smooth glide, every dancer who moves with passion and purpose. Michael Peters may be gone, but the rhythm he created will never fade. This version enhances emotional depth while Howard Rollins. Howard Rollins, a tragic talent lost beneath Hollywood's lights. Howard Rollins Jr., an Oscar-nominated star for his mesmerizing performance in Ragtime, once captivated audiences with his raw emotion and undeniable talent. But behind the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, his life unraveled, a battle with addiction and inner demons that cast a long shadow over his brilliance. In his final days, Rollins lay in St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital in New York, his body frail, ravaged by illness. His once radiant skin had faded to a ghostly pallor, bruised and battered by a failing immune system. AIDS had stripped him of his defenses, leaving pneumonia to steal what little strength remained. The fire in his once bright eyes had dimmed, dulled by fever and exhaustion, staring blankly at a world slipping away. But the cruelest fate of all? The man who had once breathed life into unforgettable characters could no longer recall his own lines. His powerful voice, once commanding, had been reduced to fragmented, broken whispers, a performer whose stage had gone dark long before his time. On December 8, 1996, Howard Rollins Jr. took his final breath in a cold, lonely hospital room. His past triumphs, once celebrated, had faded into obscurity. From a rising star to a tragic footnote in Hollywood's archives, his story remains a haunting reminder of how quickly the spotlight can dim. Glenn Burke, the man who invented the high five and the tragic fate that followed. Glenn Burke was more than just a talented baseball player. He was a pioneer, the first openly gay athlete in Major League Baseball. But instead of glory, his courage cost him everything. Shunned by the sport he loved, cast aside by teammates in the league, Burke became an outcast. The same world he had helped change refused to stand by him. In his later years, he wandered the streets, hungry, forgotten, lost, walking the same road where crowds had once cheered his name. When AIDS took hold of his body, his sister took him in, offering a final place of refuge in San Leandro, California. But by then it was too late. The man who had once been a powerhouse on the field was now frail, his body wasting away. Pneumonia gripped his lungs, each breath a painful struggle. Yet the most heartbreaking sight was his hands. The same hands that had created the legendary high five, that had reached the sky in celebration, now frozen, curled inward, unable to open. On May 30th, 1995, Glenn Burke passed away, penniless and alone. A man who had once filled stadiums with joy left the world in silence, but his legacy endures. The high five, a simple gesture of triumph, unity, and connection, lives on as an unspoken tribute to the man the world tried to forget. Ricky Wilson. Ricky Wilson, the guitar that fell silent too soon. Ricky Wilson, the brilliant guitarist of B-52s, was a visionary who crafted electrifying, one-of-a-kind melodies that helped define an era. His unique, raw sound pulsed through the heart of a generation, shaping the new wave movement in ways that can still be felt today. But as his band soared to new heights, Ricky carried a secret, a battle with AIDS that he never shared, not even with those closest to him. In his final days, he lay in Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, a shadow of the vibrant musician he once was. His body had withered, his skin pale and dry, but the most heartbreaking sight wasn't his frail frame. It was his hands. Those hands, once so alive, so effortless in their artistry, now lay still and rigid. When his bandmates visited, they watched in silent grief as he placed his fingers on a guitar, desperate to play, to create one last song. But his body had betrayed him. On October 12, 1985, Ricky Wilson passed away in silence, never uttering a final word. And just like that, the music stopped. The world lost a sound that could never be replicated, leaving behind an emptiness that no song could ever fill. Kevin Peter Hall. Kevin Peter Hall, the silent fall of a gentle giant. Kevin Peter Hall had a gift. He could breathe life into towering, fearsome creatures, most famously as a relentless predator, an unstoppable force on screen. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, the real battle he faced was one he couldn't win. In 1990, after a car accident, Kevin underwent a blood transfusion, one that unknowingly carried a silent killer. HIV crept into his system, undetected at first, but when it struck, it did so with merciless precision. The once mighty actor found himself in a fight he could never conquer. At Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, the giant who had once loomed over movie screens lay motionless, his towering 7 feet 2 inches frame now fragile and withered. Pneumonia clutched his lungs, forcing him onto a ventilator. His once powerful hands, capable of embodying terrifying, monstrous beings, now trembled, too weak to lift. His sunken eyes, once filled with warmth and life, stared out hollow and dim. On April 10, 1991, at just 35 years old, Kevin Peter Hall took his final breath. There was no triumphant Hollywood comeback, no heroic final scene, just a quiet, sorrowful end of a gentle giant. Roy Simmons, when the cheers faded. Roy Simmons was once a force on the football field, a fierce and gifted athlete who played for renowned teams like the New York Giants and Washington Redskins. He even battled on a grand stage of Super Bowl XVIII, his name echoing through stadiums filled with thousands of adoring fans. At one time, he stood at the heart of the roaring crowds, basking in their applause, a symbol of strength and triumph. But when he came out as gay, the cheers fell silent. The spotlight that once illuminated his talent dimmed, and the doors to his career slammed shut. Cast aside and forgotten by the league that once embraced him, Roy found himself adrift, plunging into a world of drugs, fleeting relationships, and an undiagnosed battle with HIV. By the time the disease took hold, all he had left was a small, crumbling apartment in the Bronx. The once powerful athlete, who had sprinted downfield with unstoppable force, now lay frail and frozen, his legs curled up and useless. The body that once defied defenders could no longer fight. Food became a distant memory. Pain was his only companion. On February 20th, 2014, Roy Simmons died alone, a forgotten man in a world that had once celebrated him. The stadiums that had thundered with his name stood empty. The legacy he carried, the dreams he had embodied, were left to fade into a cold, merciless silence. Jermaine Stewart. Jermaine Stewart. A voice fading into darkness. Jermaine Stewart's infectious energy once lit up the airwaves. His hit We Don't Have to Take Our Clothes Off cemented him as a charismatic and electrifying R&B star. His voice was joyful, his presence magnetic. But behind the music, his reality was far from the carefree world his songs portrayed. When age struck, he disappeared from the public eye, spending his final years in isolation. He had contracted HIV after years of indulgence but kept it hidden, fearing the stigma. As the disease took its toll, he retreated to a small, quiet home in Homewood, Illinois, a place that had once echoed with laughter but now sat in haunting silence. His body withered. His liver, ravaged by AIDS, failed him. His stomach swelled with fluid, while his arms and legs grew frail, too weak to move. He could no longer eat, no longer speak. He simply stared into a corner of the room where an old radio sat, silent, like him. On March 17, 1997, Jermaine Stewart passed away at just 39 years old. There was no fanfare, no grand farewell. The stage lights had long dimmed. The crowd's cheers faded into oblivion. And when Jermaine's voice fell silent, the world lost more than just a singer. It lost a dreamer whose melodies once danced through the night. Essex Hemphill. Essex Hemphill, the poet who spoke for the forgotten. Essex Hemphill was more than a poet. He was a warrior, wielding words like weapons, his poetry a battle cry for the oppressed. He gave voice to the unheard, especially within the Black LGBTQ+ community, turning silence into resistance, pain into power. But just as his fire began to burn brightly, it was cruelly extinguished. Like so many of his generation, HIV found him. As the disease ravaged his body, he did not surrender. He kept writing, kept speaking, kept fighting. Even as his strength faded, his spirit remained unbroken. In his final days, he lay in a small, dimly lit room in Philadelphia. His only companion, the silent walls that bore witness to his slow decline. His body withered, his skin turned pale, his breath grew labored. Each inhale and exhale another battle against time. But his greatest tragedy wasn't just the illness. It was being forgotten while still alive. The friends who once praised his brilliance were nowhere to be found. His pen slipped from his grasp. Blank pages lay untouched. The phone never rang. His final days passed in silence. No conversations, no poetry, just the slow, fading rhythm of his breath. On November 4th, 1995, Essex Hemphill died alone at the age of 38. The man who had once ignited hope in his community slipped into darkness, unnoticed. But though the world moved on, his words did not. They remain, an echo that refuses to fade. Tony Fields. Tony Fields, when the spotlight faded. Once, Tony Fields lit up Broadway, captivating audiences with his effortless grace and boundless energy. His movements were poetry in motion, his presence magnetic. But when AIDS came for him, the spotlight that had once bathed him in brilliance dimmed, and his once powerful body withered into frailty. On February 27, 1995, at St. Joseph's Hospital in Burbank, California, Tony lay motionless, barely clinging to life. His immune system had collapsed, leaving him trapped in a body that could no longer serve him. His muscles had wasted away, his skin had lost its color, and his eyes, once alight with passion, barely flickered open. Just a few years earlier, this was a body that had leaped and twirled effortlessly across the stage, commanding standing ovations. Now, he could not even lift a finger. The pain coursed through him, relentless and unyielding. But there was no audience left to witness his suffering, no thunderous applause to comfort him. At just 36 years old, Tony Fields took his final bow, but this time there was no curtain call, no roaring crowd, only silence, a talent lost too soon, a name that should have shone brighter, for longer. Another star extinguished before the world had the chance to truly see him. Allen Wiggins. Allen Wiggins, a star that faded into darkness. Allen Wiggins was a blazing talent, a speedster who electrified stadiums while playing for San Diego Padres and Baltimore Orioles. But his rise to baseball glory was eclipsed by the demons of addiction. Drugs and illness stole everything: his career, his health, his future. When the game left him behind, his life unraveled. Poverty and sickness tightened their grip, pulling him deeper into the shadows. By June 1st, 1991, Wiggins lay frail and broken in a small, dimly lit house in Los Angeles, too weak to stand. The body that had once been built for speed had withered beyond recognition. Malnutrition drained his strength, pneumonia crushed his lungs, and the same legs that had once sprinted across stadiums could barely shift beneath a thin, tattered blanket. At just 32 years old, Allen Wiggins took his final breath. The roaring crowds had long since gone silent. A man who once embodied limitless potential had become another forgotten tragedy, another star that burned too brightly, only to fade too soon. Stoney Jackson. Stoney Jackson, a vanishing act in isolation. Once a familiar face on American television, Stoney Jackson had his moment in the spotlight, only to vanish just as quickly. As HIV ravaged his body, the world moved on, barely noticing his decline. On October 20th, 1995, in a lonely hospital room in Los Angeles, Stoney lay motionless in his bed, his body so frail that movement was no longer possible. His once magnetic eyes, once brimming with charisma, had lost their spark. The sterile white walls enclosed him, yet no one came. No family, no friends, just the rhythmic beeping of machines, quietly counting down his final moments. At just 35 years old, Stoney Jackson slipped away, unnoticed and unremembered. From a household name to a forgotten soul, he faded into obscurity, as if he had never existed at all. Gene Anthony Ray. Gene Anthony Ray. From stardom to shadows, Gene Anthony Ray danced his way into the hearts of millions with fame, electrifying the screen with his raw talent and boundless energy. But his life was no dazzling encore. It was a tragic descent, a slow unraveling of a star dimmed too soon. Drugs, illness, and poverty stole his future, each setback chipping away at the brilliance that once defined him. On November 14th, 2003, in a quiet New York hospital room, Gene lay powerless. His immune system had failed, a stroke had left him motionless, and the body that once soared across stages was now frail and still. There was no audience, no standing ovation, just the hum of medical machines and the weight of silence. At 41, Gene Anthony Ray took his final bow, not to thunderous applause, but to the quiet indifference of a world that had long since moved on. The star who once shined so brightly faded before he ever had the chance to rise again. Eazy-E, the final days of a gangster rap legend. Eazy-E, the mastermind behind gangster rap's rise, laid the foundation for NWA, reshaping hip-hop forever. But no amount of swagger or street toughness could fight off the enemy that came for him, HIV. The disease hit fast, and within a month of his diagnosis, he was gone. On March 26, 1995, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, Eazy lay in a coma, caught in the cruel limbo between life and death. A ventilator forced air into his failing lungs, his once defiant body now powerless. Just days before, from his hospital bed, he had married, one final act of love in the face of a future that would never come. At just 30 years old, Eazy-E passed away, leaving behind a legacy as controversial as it was legendary. His voice may have gone silent, but his music still echoes, an untamed force that refuses to fade. David Hampton. David Hampton, the infamous con man, died alone on July 18, 2003, at Jersey City Medical Center in New Jersey. He lay motionless on his hospital bed, his body skeletal, frail, and ravaged by disease. His once vibrant skin had faded to a pallid hue, marred by bruises from a failing immune system. His half-open eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, unrecognizable from the man who once deceived New York with his elaborate lies. The hospital room was cold and silent. No visitors came. No hands reached for him in his final moments. His cracked lips trembled as if trying to form words, but no sound escaped. His breathing grew weaker, shallower, until at last it ceased altogether. He slipped away without a whisper, without a witness. Hours passed before a nurse entered the room, only to find that he had been gone for some time. The man who once captivated the world with his fabrications had now disappeared without a trace. No mourners, no final words. No one left to ask what became of him. In the end, his greatest punishment wasn't the disease. It was being utterly forgotten. Like Hampton, the 21 black celebrities we remember today all met a tragic fate shaped by the relentless grip of AIDS. This devastating disease took them too soon, forcing them to spend their final days in pain, isolation, and cruel obscurity. But they weren't just victims of illness. They were victims of stigma, of a society that turned its back on them when they needed it most. Once celebrated in their prime, they were abandoned when they fell. But their stories deserve to be told. Which of these touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comment below, so we can honor their legacies, because no one deserves to be forgotten.